Hi, Rob B here with Rob D, and you are listening to the Property Podcast, episode 229. Sometimes in property, things just happen and they go under the radar, and this could be one of those things that you're just missing. So this week, we're looking at the mortgage shake-up that you need to understand.
Yes, welcome to the Property Podcast. Thank you for joining us. I think you're spot on, Rob, when you said that some things go under the radar. And this is one of those that for some people, for a lot of people, it won't affect at all. But for another group, this is going to have, I think, as big an impact as all the tax changes, which have been talked about endlessly. And yet this hasn't really been talked about at all. So in this episode, we're going to put that right. We're going to explain who it affects, what it is, what it all means, what you should do about it, and all that good stuff.
We are, but before we get going, quick mention, our meetups are tonight. What are the meetups? The Property Hub meetups. They happen on the first Thursday of every single month. So if you're listening to this on the day it comes out, you've still got time. But if you're listening to the future, have a look at your calendar, because guess what? They happen on the first Thursday of every month. So tonight, I will be in Bournemouth. Rob, you are overseas. No surprise there. Rob, you're in Rotterdam, and it sounds very nice too. But I'll be in Bournemouth, but they're all over the country. So go to thepropertyhub.net/meetups, and you can see where your nearest meetup is. Get along, full of friendly people. Just talk property, no cost. What have you got to lose?
Nothing at all is the answer to that. So, yep, get along to one of those. And while you're there, you can amaze and astound everyone with this news story, unless they've also listened to the podcast, in which case they'll already know it. But this story is from Property Wire, and the headline is, Research reveals the extent of price drops by property agents in London. And the statistic is that 35% of all properties that are currently being advertised in London have had their price reduced since they were first marketed. And back in February, that was 29%. So that's an increase throughout this year. And the biggest reductions, interestingly, have been in Richmond and Kingston upon Thames. So these are some of the most expensive areas in London, having the biggest price drops. And another statistic hiding in there is that nationally, so for the whole country now, 77% of properties are selling below their asking price. So I think that's really interesting when you take that all together. We've talked in the recent past about where we are in the cycle and how we might be coming up to this wobble. And when you look at stats like that, it really does seem like it's becoming a bit of a buyer's market. And there's the opportunity to do deals, whereas previously there might not have been.
Absolutely. And this ties in, again, very much London related with the recent figures from Foxtons. Foxtons did very poorly recently. Not surprisingly, because we've seen this happening, but their numbers were dire. And I think it'll actually get worse before it gets better for them. So this trend, although it just seems like we've been talking about this for a while, the reason that is because we said it was coming for a while and now it's happening. So obviously we're just reporting that news. Of course, long-time listeners to the podcast will know what we believe is next. But it's really interesting to see it play out. It's almost spooky sometimes because you talk about it with certainty, like, oh, and this thing will happen, and then we've seen it happening, and then this next thing will happen. So it is a bit weird, but when it just plays out like this, it just seems so obvious as well. As Rob said, it's a buyer's market. But I think that's what makes this week's topic so important is people will see opportunity and just plow in. But right now in property, investing absolutely is a great thing to do. But just plowing in head first could be dangerous. And that's why we're looking at this topic this week, which as a jigsaw piece is really important. But there's lots of jigsaw pieces at the moment, Rob.
Yes, indeed. So we'll pull together some of the threads at the end and kind of come to a broader conclusion. But let's start by looking specifically at the mortgage shake-up you need to understand. What is that shake-up? Okay, well, this is something that's being brought about by the Bank of England. The Bank of England have got a division called the Prudential Regulation Authority. That's the PRA. So if you ever see PRA floating around on forums, which you might do occasionally, that's what it's referring to. It's a part of the Bank of England that regulates lenders. Now they, of course, as part of their remit, have got stability in the sector. And they saw what happened last time when we had the build-up to the last crash. And as we all know, history repeats, but they don't want history to repeat itself in quite that way. So they want to bring lending under control and make sure that it's done safely. So they've put in some new rules that lenders have to follow to avoid that risky lending that contributed to the last crash. So these changes were announced last year. They're coming in this year in two parts. The first part has already happened. Since January 2017, this year, lenders have had to use tougher rental cover tests. We're going to talk about those in just a moment. The second part is coming in September this year, so just around the corner now, and this is more detailed underwriting for portfolio landlords. So landlords who have multiple properties are going to be assessed more rigorously than those who only have one or two. So those are the two parts. There's the rental cover and there's the underwriting for portfolio landlords. We'll look at each of those separately. Let's start with the rental cover.
Okay, so listen up. This is not one of those podcasts that you can part listen to because you're going to hear some numbers and some information. And if you interpret it the wrong way, you could be making some poor decisions. So if you can't give this your full attention now, maybe come back to it when you can or have a first listen. But make sure you come back to this part of the podcast, the next couple of parts, when you have got time possibly to make notes and really absorb what we're saying. So the first part we're going to look at, as Rob said, is rental cover. And this is already in place. Some people don't know that, but it's already in place. So what are the rental cover rules if you're buying a property with a mortgage in your own name? Okay, so first of all, the rent cover must be at least 125% of the mortgage payment when interest is at 5.5%. So what does that mean? Well, for those who are hearing that for the first time, it probably sounds a little baffling, and it is difficult to explain. So let me give you a real-life example. If your mortgage payment at 5.5%, say, is £500, okay, so you're at an interest rate of 5.5% and your mortgage is £500, so your rent must be £625. So if your mortgage payment is 500 at 5.5%, and remember, people are paying a lot less than 5.5%, so you need to work out where you'd be at 5.5% if you've got a property already. It would need to be 125% of that number. So at £500 at 5.5%, you would need £625 in rent. Okay, hopefully that makes sense, but again, stop, rewind, and go back. Now, that sounds quite high, but many lenders are actually using 145%, so be aware of that. But that's already in place. If you're buying in your own name, and again, please listen to our point, we're going to talk about who this is applicable to and who it doesn't apply to in a minute. But if you're buying in your own name, this is already in place.
Yeah, this is in place now. Something similar has been done in the past. All lenders have done rental cover calculations. But just to be clear, the difference is now that they must stick to these numbers. So in the past, a lender might have tested based on 125% at your current pay rate or at your current pay rate plus 1% or whatever they felt like doing. They could each decide what test they wanted to apply. But now across the board, it's this 5.5% test. So even if you've got a loan at 2.5% now or something like that, and there's absolutely bags of monthly profit in it, they're going to be stress testing it for you at this 5.5% rate. And as Rob said, 125% is the base. Some lenders are doing 145%. So this isn't a new concept, but what's new is that all lenders are going to be testing in this particular way. And for many, it's going to be more stringent than it was before.
Yeah, it's a really important point, Rob, that it has always been around. Just most people haven't been aware of it because they work with a mortgage broker and they'll go off and figure it out. Now, you're probably thinking, oh, this all sounds quite complex, and that would be a fair response. So there's a simple way of just doing a calculation to see if it's going to work out for you or not when you're looking at a buy-to-let property and assessing it against the rent. You know, you could go quite far down the line and then realise that you're not going to be able to get a mortgage to the level you'd like. So, as a rule of thumb, there's two ways you can do this. You can, for every £100 of rent, that will support £15,000 of borrowing. So if the rent, for example, is £500, then you can borrow £75,000. If it costs 100k, then you're fine. So if you're buying at 100k, leveraging at 75%, 75,000, a rent of 500 will do it. Or another way is take your rent and times it by 200 if you're leveraging at 75%. So, for example, again, if we use 500, your 500 times that by 200, that's 100k, you're fine if you're buying at 100k. You'll struggle at more, and if you're doing less, well then great, if you're lending at 75%. So whichever way you calculate it, I just prefer to work out 200 times the rent, so it gives me a very quick calculation because I borrow at 75%. Whichever way you do it doesn't matter, but at least now you've got a quick calculation on how to do it. So remember, if it costs more than 100k in this example, you can buy it, but you're going to need a larger deposit, which will probably mean a lower return on your investment. Now, here's the key part. It doesn't apply to everyone. Started to mention this, but it's really important you listen up and understand who this is for and who it isn't. It is for people buying properties under their own name. So for people buying in their own name, and many of us have portfolios already, you may not be looking to buy in your own name moving forward because you may be buying through a limited company. But I'm sure if you already have a portfolio, then you will look to refinance some of those properties at some point in the future. This will affect you. But Rob, again, it's not straightforward. There's a bit to understand here too.
Yeah, exactly. So if you've got a portfolio in your own name already and you come to remortgage, if you want to remortgage at a higher amount because the value of the property has gone up and you want to pull some money out, then these tests will apply. You will be tested in exactly the way that we've just talked about. If, though, you're just remortgaging without increasing the level of debt, so for example, you've got a property with one lender, there's a better deal available with another lender, you don't want to take any more money, you're just going to shift that debt from one lender to another, then in theory, lenders don't have to apply these tests. They can choose to, but they don't have to. So some lenders will choose to test everything the same way because it's easier and safer and they're a bit worried about getting into trouble with their regulator, but they won't necessarily. So when this first started getting talked about, people were freaking out about the fact that they would basically be mortgage prisoners because they might have a property that doesn't stack up under this new set of rules, and therefore they thought they'd be stuck with that lender. Well, it might in fact be more difficult to switch lenders than it was because other lenders might decide to start applying these, but not necessarily. So that's an important distinction. But Rob, that's who it does apply to, but you were just saying who it doesn't.
Yeah, so making it clear, it doesn't apply to everyone. So you may have guessed some already, but let's make it clear. People who are taking out mortgages for limited companies doesn't apply to. People using bridging lending doesn't apply to. People who are doing commercial or semi-commercial property and using lending specifically for those properties doesn't apply to. Holiday lets, again, doesn't apply to. And any loans with a fixed term of 5 years or longer. That's really interesting. That's a possible hack to get away and around this one. Any loans with a fixed term of 5 years or longer. Some people might actually want to go down that route as well to get some stability. So remember, you've got that one there. But ultimately, what does this all mean? Well, you won't get as much leverage for low-yielding properties. So if you're buying property in London or the South East in your own name, chances are it won't stack and you can't get lending at 75%. Unless you are operating in one of those ways we've just listed. But if you're buying in your own name, you may struggle.
Okay, so that's the first part. That's the rental cover. That's what came in January. But wait, there's more. If that wasn't complicated enough for you, there's even more complication ahead. This is portfolio landlord underwriting that's coming in starting in September this year. So the gist is that the PRA, the regulator, is forcing lenders to look at portfolio landlords in more detail. Because, of course, they're thinking, well, if someone's got lots of properties, then they're perhaps stretching themselves. There's more risk there than if someone just has one or two. So let's dig into the detail of that. First of all, what is a portfolio landlord? Well, their definition is it's somebody with 4 or more mortgaged properties. So if you've got 6 properties with mortgages, clearly you're a portfolio landlord. If you've got 5 properties, but only 3 of them have mortgages, and the other 2 are owned free and clear, you're not a portfolio landlord. It's 4 or more mortgaged properties. If you have any mortgaged properties in a limited company, as well as in your own name, then any in that company do count towards the total. So this won't apply to the vast majority of landlords in the UK. I can't remember the proportions, but the overwhelming majority just have 1. Having more than 3 is actually really unusual. But if you're listening to the Property Podcast, there's a higher probability, of course, that this will apply to you or that it will in the future. You probably aspire to have 4 or more properties. Chances are a lot of them are going to be mortgaged. So what are they going to be looking at? Well, basically, they're going to want to see a lot more about your business as a whole. So each lender is deciding what it wants to see. They're all gradually coming out with their own guidelines about exactly what needs to be presented to them. But the PRA has suggested a big list of things that they should ask to see. You ready for a big list? Here we go. Okay, they're going to ask for a property portfolio spreadsheet, a cash flow forecast spreadsheet, an income and expenditure spreadsheet, a business plan, 3 months of bank statements, SA 302s and tax overviews from HMRC, and tenancy agreements for all properties. Basically, the gist of all that is that they're not just going to be looking at the one particular loan that you're making. They want to look at that loan in the context of your entire rental business. So all those different documents are trying to get a sense of what your whole rental business looks like. So they can make a broader decision than just going, oh yeah, this one property, fine, yep, that looks all right. So what's this going to mean? Well, I think straight away, one clear implication is that applications are going to be slower, especially at first, because there's more for the lender to look at. They're going to have to ask for a lot more documentation. Brokers and borrowers aren't necessarily going to be used to providing this. There's going to be doubt about the format. So it's just going to take longer for these to go through, especially to start with. Another potential effect is that more applications are going to end up being declined because they're going to be looking at more information. Therefore, there's more things that they could decide that they don't like. You might have had this with lenders in the past anyway, where it seems to fit criteria, but they just decide, sort of seemingly at random, that there's something about the case that they just don't like and they're going to turn it down. Well, now there's more for them to decide that they don't like because they're going to be looking at more information. So it's possible that you'll start out with one lender, everything looks okay, then at some point in the process they'll go, oh no, don't like this for some reason, and you're going to have to switch to another lender. That's a possibility, but we'll see. This hasn't started yet, so we'll have to see how this shakes out. Another important thing to say about this is that it doesn't, again, apply to limited companies. So this is only for properties that you are buying or remortgaging in your own name. Limited companies have to do a lot of this anyway, so this is not like it's a loophole or an exception, really. What it's effectively doing is that individual portfolio landlords are going to have the same level of scrutiny as they would do if they were going for a commercial loan. So more paperwork all round.
Yay, said nobody. Right, I think it's time to bring this all together. So, first point is, if you're not using a mortgage broker already, a mortgage advisor, then you probably should start. It's already challenging, but it's only going to get harder. A good one is worth their weight in gold. We said this many times, but use an experienced mortgage advisor who can guide you through all these numerous hurdles that we now have to go through. And that applies even if you're not buying in your own name. As Rob's already touched on, buying through a limited company is quite an ordeal in itself. There's a lot of paperwork, information you have to provide, and it does mean those applications can drag out. So just be wary of that. It also means that rental cover tests mean bigger deposits in London. It's part of the market now. You just can't buy property in London in probably 99% of the areas and make it work with a 75% mortgage because of the rental stress tests. It shouldn't affect anywhere else, possibly the southeast. If you can still make it work in the southeast now, it's not going to last much longer. It's probably touch and go. But Yorkshire, northwest, northeast, Midlands, you're fine. There's plenty of profit left in the rentals, so don't worry if you're currently invested in those areas. But ultimately, Rob, it's just another measure that will either, as we said at the top of the show, go onto the radar and people not even realise until very late on and find themselves in a bit of pain or discomfort, or will just deter and put off amateur landlords in the first place if they do find out about this. You know, there might be somebody listening to this. This could be the first podcast. I do apologise if it is. You think, oh, I might get into property. Let's start here. Not probably the best one to start on. Maybe do the episode where property can change your life. You may feel a bit more inspired. But the thing is, if people are hearing about this and they are brand new, they may just go, it's not worth the bother. But that creates opportunity. Because while we're in this phase, though, where we feel we're going into a bit of a wobble in the market right now, and we're going to see some negative headlines, which are already happening, it also means an opportunity for the people who are serious. And let's face it, if you listen to a podcast called The Property Podcast, you're probably pretty serious about property. So for you listening, you can take advantage of all this. But what it means is, and we were talking about this before we turned the mics on, is that you just can't go into property now and go, you know what? I've got 50k, I'll buy myself a property and then crack on with life. You can't do it anymore. If it was just this, you'd think, maybe I can manage and get through. But it's not. There's so much happening now in the property market. Amateurs just can't pile in like they used to. You need guidance, you need help.
Yeah, absolutely. And I've been saying this for a while, but I really do think that it's going to become the domain of people who are professional. Now, I don't mean professionals. I don't mean that you have to be a company or a really big player to succeed in property, but you have to be professional in your attitude. You have to educate yourself and have the right advice and have a bit of a plan and know what you're doing. For the last 20 odd years since we've had buy-to-let, the buy-to-let mortgage is now 20 years old. Basically, people have been, largely speaking, just sort of spotting that they've got a bit of money in the bank. There's a property for sale on the next street over, so they'll go into the estate agent, buy it, get it let out and not think too much about it. You really won't be able to do that anymore in most parts of the country, either because you're going to get hammered on the tax because you don't understand how that works, or you're not going to be able to get as much of a mortgage as you want, or there'll be some kind of hurdle in the lettings process because there's now so much more legislation around that. You can't just blag it in the same way as people have done in the past. And honestly, I think that's a good thing. I think it's good for tenants because they're going to have landlords who take their investment seriously and are switched on. It's good for society more generally if you don't get a load of people who are completely uninformed speculating on an important asset class. And it's good for the likes of people who are listening to this podcast because it means you're ahead of the game in terms of getting up to speed with all this kind of stuff.
And it's good for us because we create the content and it keeps us busy. So silver linings all round. Yes, I completely agree, Rob, and I have to give you credit. This is something you have been talking about for a long time, and I agreed when you made the initial point way back when. I can't remember how long ago it was now, and it was because just the start of the changes, really. But it was really last week when it dawned on me, not so much agreement, but just seeing it as there is really no other way. You might be able to just about get away with it now if you're winging it, but it's going to get harder and harder, and I think what you've predicted will absolutely play out. Absolutely play out. It's really interesting, but there are plenty of upsides and there is plenty of opportunity, and it will rule out the amateurs. But the amateurs are the ones who get burnt as well, the hardest. So it could be a good thing overall. My only concern is it does create a bit more of the haves and have-nots that we talked about last week, because some people just give up and not benefit from property at all, and the people who are in it will just become wealthier, trying to not smash those silver linings away. But there are always going to be pros and cons to every decision. I think broadly speaking, there is more positivity around these decisions than negativity for what you've outlined, Rob. But it's really interesting what's playing out. But the key point is you have to listen to the Property Podcast. Right. We've got a resource of the week, which is probably why many of you turn up for the Property Podcast, and we'll let you know what's coming up next week. But before we do, we have to thank one of our amazing listeners who has left us a review. Every week we read out at least one review. Plenty come in all the time, so thank you to the support. I don't know how many it is now, but there's a lot. So thank you. It keeps us right at the top of the iTunes charts, and we are constantly near the top of the business charts. So thank you. So this week's review is from David, and David says, I've been listening to the podcast for a couple of years now, and I look forward to a new episode every week. Rob and Rob deliver fantastic insights in a passionate, easy digestible, and open and honest way. There's a lot of landlord bashing out there, and listening to this podcast not only lifts my spirit, but reaffirms my belief that there are many of us in property business who do make money whilst keeping our integrity and contributing to society. Great job, guys. Keep up the good work, David. Well, thank you, David. I think you'll like next week's podcast based on what you've just said. But before we do, Rob, we've got Resource of the Week, and I've not looked yet because we haven't had time, but I just love it from the title alone.
Yeah, this is a bit of a geeky one, so you might not come with me on this one, but let's see. So this is called podsync.net, podsync. So basically synchronizing podcasts. See what they did there. What it allows you to do is take a YouTube playlist or a YouTube channel and get it into your podcast app. So basically, you just go onto this site, you pop in the address of the YouTube channel that you're interested in, and it spits out a link that you'll put into your podcast app, whether that's Pocket Casts or whatever it is that you use. So you've then got it alongside all your podcasts. What's the benefit of that? Well, a couple of different things. So it gives you the option as well to strip out the video, so you've just got the audio left. So you've basically taken a YouTube channel and turned it into a podcast, which is pretty cool. Or you can keep the video, but having it in your podcast app means that you can download it just like you download a podcast, which means that you can watch offline. So if you're on a flight or underground or something like that, you can watch YouTube videos where previously you would have had to stream them. There's other ways of downloading YouTube videos, but I think this way is really cool because it just comes in along with all the podcast content anyway. You don't need another app. You don't need to do anything special. So I'm really excited about this because I spot lots of YouTube content that I really like, but I never quite get around to watching it. And when I'm on the move, I can't easily watch it. And that solves that problem for me.
Exactly the same, Rob. It's one of my biggest frustrations with YouTube is not being able to download the content because I find it difficult just to sit at my computer and watch it as I go. And when you're traveling, you don't always have Wi-Fi or 4G. So being able to download it onto my phone and watch it when I'm ready is absolutely brilliant. So at the very least, Rob, I've gone with you on that one. I think it's a great resource. So next week, we prove that landlords are amazing.
Yeah, we do. Or at least we get into the data and look at the reality of what landlords are like. We spotted that there are a few different reports that have come out recently into the private rented sector, and some headlines have come out of that, unsurprisingly, painting landlords as not being the most helpful bunch. But what does the data really show? We've dug into it and we've pulled out a number of different facts about the current rental market, which might surprise you. So while this episode has been an important but quite heavy listen, I think next week should be a lot easier all round, and you're bound to learn at least a few things that surprise you.
But it will not surprise you that we're back next Thursday with the Property Podcast. Remember, the meetups are tonight. If you're listening on the day this comes out, the first Thursday of every month are meetups. So go to propertyhub.net/meetups to check that out. And between the meetups tonight and the Property Podcast next week, we've got Ask Rob and Rob on Tuesday. So plenty going on to satisfy your property urges. So until one of those events, whichever one you turn up to next, we wish you well. Take care. Goodbye.
Bye-bye. Thanks for listening to the Property Podcast. For show notes, all our past episodes, and to leave a review, go to thepropertyhub.net/podcast.